I believe yesterday's video was very interesting. I'm glad it was very well received, with a lot of discussion so far about mainline opening theory. One of the latest comments I saw this morning on the video by Electro Music Course was this. He wrote, "I try to avoid all the main lines whenever possible. That is why I use the Bronstein variation of the Scandinavian against 1e4. It is a dynamic position. I know it 10 times better than my opponent, and I know that if I play good chess, I can win. What more could you want?" Indeed, Electrico, indeed. And I actually do have a book by Bronstein. I wonder if you have it too. It's called David Bronstein, Chess Improviser. I wonder also, okay, David Bronstein, we know he was a great chess improviser, or I hope you do, and that it was Mikhail Botvinnik who invented the Slav system, who did a lot of research to popularize it, that was sometimes outraged by David Bronstein's openings. Now, I took out this book this morning, and actually there is quite an in-depth discussion. Back in the 1950s, Bronstein had the idea that there was no such thing as opening theory, despite it all starting to be catalogued. And I'm realizing now that I believe David Bronstein was onto something, even back in his games. I believe he used the opening not to play any sort of theory, but actually to get winning trump cards. And I use the word trumps because I hear a lot of grandmasters use that, and I prefer that to the idea of imbalances, because a trump card is like a winning favourable imbalance, which you can sometimes get out of the opening. So King's Crusher's dictionary, weakness. A weakness is not visually a weakness like double pawns or triple pawns. A weakness to be a weakness needs to be exploitable. Opening. An opening is not to get control of the centre, to develop pieces, or other things. An opening is to get winning trump cards. With those two definitions, you'll arm yourself, I believe, with aggressive concepts which you need to win at chess and play creatively. David Bronstein, in this opening chapter of this book, which I recommend, The Chess Improviser, so it's by B.S. Weinstein. If I can quote you some of this. Basically, Bronstein came to the conclusion that they, and he's referring to Chigorin, Lasker, Schlesser, Capablanca, Alekhine, Reti and Botvinnik, employed at least 4 different opening strategies, namely tabia, which are common sense systems, forcing variations, and systems with counter chances. So basically, tabia is like what I mentioned in that video, the Queen's Gambit Decline, which Capablanca used to play. That was all on the rage, to get that position in the Queen's Gambit Declined. Common sense is like the G3 systems that I mentioned, like International Master Michael Henning's been playing. Common sense, and you can get like a spring as well as an armory, that if your opponent does something wrong, your position springs to life, like the bishops did in that game. And forcing systems, and systems with counter chances. But I think it's on this last aspect, systems with counter chances. I think the emphasis here is on creating imbalances, but we want more than that. We don't just want imbalances, we want winning trump cards. And game 1 of this book, I think, fully demonstrates this idea. If you want to redefine your concept of what an opening is, don't pay attention to any opening theory. Just think instead, you'll pay attention to trying to get yourself winning trump cards from the opening. So in game 1, this did make an impression on me, and I was going to video annotate this before, but maybe I'm glad now. This is more of a meaningful context, because it shows a major opening innovation by Bronstein, and he's made several major opening innovations, and it's no coincidence. The background context to this is this guy was extremely creative, in contrast to a workaholic, like Botvinnik, who would just research standard systems. Bronstein, okay, he'd improvise, but he's making his opponent improvise. It's not all one-way improvisation. So here against Rojahn, Moscow Olympiad 1956. You'll probably never see this game on YouTube. I don't think anyone's covered it. But let's check out the opening, and let's redefine opening as a way of getting winning trump cards. So e4, e5. So knight f3, knight 6. All standard stuff so far, except instead of Roy Lopez, he went back to bishop c4. After knight f6, we have this invitation for knight g5, so seemingly sharp, long theoretical line. Okay, actually I'm going to turn off this engine at the bottom, I don't need it. So black reacts in the centre with d5, and after ed we get the knight a5 line, which I think this is still the most trodden path so far. But now, instead of bishop b5 check, which I think is the most popular move, Bronstein played d3, and I think he's got a very specific idea with d3. He's basing this game on the trump cards of the pawns being a dangerous force, an armada of pawns in particular. After h6, knight f3, okay, the opponent seized this opportunity to try and break open the centre and played e4. Now I wonder, if I give you 10 seconds, what do you think David Bronstein played here? So 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, he played d takes e4. He just gave up his entire bishop. Okay, engines might think this is unsound, but the point is to create these winning trump cards from the opening. I'm not talking about just imbalances, we're talking about winning imbalances, what I call trumps. A lot of GMs refer to trumps, I haven't made it up completely. Redefine what you think the opening phase of the game is. You want to get trump cards from the opening. Is David Bronstein aiming for such trump cards? I believe he is. Knight takes c4, queen d4. Okay, he's a piece down, but his trump cards is the pawn structure inertia. And if you do sack a piece, it's always important to control e5, especially if you go a knight down, and the centre in general, but particularly e5. You don't want an opponent's knight coming to e5 later. So bear that in mind when you go a knight down. I've noticed that in some of my recent over-the-board games. Central control remains key if you're going to do any sort of gambit. You need to follow it up correctly. Respect the centre of the chessboard. That's where the magic of your pieces, they become independent of going on the queen side, the king side, wherever. But this gambit does get white. This gambit of a piece does get white a lot of central control. So his opponent actually played knight b6, and now we see c4. So the queen is actually beautifully placed in the centre in terms of central control, and also we have a potentially winning trump card, all of these pawns in the centre. Okay, so black played c5, and now queen d3. Wants to keep hold of the e-pawn. Unfortunately, can't play queen c3, the e-pawn would drop. Bishop g4, as though e5 is going to be a problem maybe, knight d7, bishop f3, knight e5. So he's got to be wary about the e5 square, so he protects with the knight. After bishop e7, both sides castle. And now he plays knight e5, hitting that bishop. And we see, after bishop h5, he's keen to really try and maintain control of e5 first, and then use his pawns. So out of the opening, he hasn't played, I don't believe this has ever been played before this game, this opening variation. His idea of playing openings is to get winning trump cards. Okay, b3, after knight bd7, he reinforces the e5 square. So if black cannot blockade on e5 against this structure, then this structure is going to be mobile. It's all about mobility of the pawns now. This is revolving around the potentially winning trump card of the pawn mobility. Or can it be restrained? So black took on e5 and tried to get a restraining order. you know, dark square control, a blockade on e5. So bishop f6. Now, can he not play f4 immediately? There might be a tactical reason, like bishop e2, queen takes, and then bishop c3 to try and contest the e5 square. Now, I haven't engine checked that, but his next move does cover the e2 square. Let's just quickly check why the trump card isn't used immediately. So f4, that's right, actually I'm right, bishop e2 would be a strong move here. So it's all about making sure that his pawn mass, which is his trump card, is fed through further from the opening into the middle game to the end game. So that's a very important detail that f4 wasn't played here. Okay, the pawn inertia has to be maintained. So actually he plays rook a e1, so he's covering against bishop e2s, and he doesn't mind just yet bishop c3, queen c3. He's still on e5, there's still no blockade, and f4 and e5 will arrive shortly. So black took on c3 actually and played queen f6. Still, e5 is now possible, so he's achieved one of his aims to keep control of e5, and now is there a light square blockade? He has to break down the light square blockade. So first he reinforces f4, and now any f6 he's got e6. So the opening has functioned correctly according to this new criteria, this revolutionary criteria, which he set in, you know, way back in 1956. And yes, he was a world championship contender. He was very close to being one of the official world champions. He's also very, very creative and dynamic. As I say, a lot of opening ideas are coming from him. So bishop g6, and now white celebrates the use of the e4 square. So this extra terrain, extra pieces in the center, beautifully centered knight here. So white's pieces are more powerful potentially with the control of the center, but he needs to break down now the light square blockade to further liberate these pawns forward, otherwise they'll be stuck on the dark squares. So queen f3, as though g4 is actually going to trap the queen. There's an immediate threat to trap the queen. So bishop h7, g4, giving the queen one square, bishop h6, rather meek. The opening has been a massive success. Look at these pawns now go. f5, queen b6, and now, okay, e5 is slightly vulnerable, has to be protected. But look, the queen is now eyeing the king. There's now potential threats of e6 and f6, as well as d6 or knight d6 or h4 and g5. These pawns are really on the way up, and it all started from the design of the opening to get winning trump cards. So black played this rather passive move f6. I think he believes probably believes his opponent's got enough compensation now for the piece. So David plays e6. After knight e5, okay, e5 needs to be re-undermined maybe later. That's one plan that springs to mind. And I think he follows that now. h4, and now g5. So he's just trying to undermine e5, and maybe even play g6 or g takes f, and maybe use the g file at some point against the black king. That would really end the game, going for the attack now. Where is black's counterplay? There's no breaks, meaningful breaks on the queen side or anything. It's all to do with pieces, because the pawn structure is just so aggressive for white. There's nothing to undermine. You know, the queen on b6, not even b5 is possible. This might have been theoretically an undermining point, but it's too strong now. This chain is just amazing. So king h1, preparing for the final assault on the black king. After queen d8, a surprising move perhaps, instead of g takes, there's the other option of squeezing the bishop further, which he actually chooses. So what's the idea here? Okay, in the game the opponent sacked the bishop. Now let's just check what's going on here. Why not bishop g8? If bishop g8, right, it's the pawn mass, d6, d6, forget about the king for the moment, as an immediate threat of winning the rook. Now e7, and now you can get to the king with knight takes f6, not only undermining e5, but if g takes g7, check, king h7, queen g6 mate. I'll just show you that. Oh, sorry, not queen g6, mate. That would be a blunder because the knight's protecting it. Rook takes e5 here with the threat now of queen g6, mate. Say check. Protect g6. Rook e6. So the queen's tied down now to defending d7 in this variation. So say b6. Now there's rook takes f6. Now with another threat, maybe rook h6 and queen g5. But let's just check that. So give black a token move here. This is mating in a beautiful line with queen e5 check. So the queen's got access to that centre, and then that'll be mating. So that's the full horror of one of the variations here. So black has to give up. It seems he gave up the bishop now in this line. So after g6, black decides to give up the bishop. Okay, so otherwise he's facing quite horrible consequences to do with d6s and knight f6s. So David took on g6, and now finally biting. It's a bit too late on white's pawn chain. d6 threatening immediately to win an entire rook. After queen b6, d7 hitting the rook, and now black is the one going a piece down. Plays knight d7, all rather desperate. It's desperately lost. But David finishes beautifully with knight takes f6 here again. So let's see, if g takes, then there's g7, just winning the rook, and if rook takes, there's rook e8, so the back row will be weak here, and if rook f8, that'll be mating in two, takes and takes because of the back row issue. So knight takes f6, nice move, check, queen g2, and black had enough here. What's going on here after the exchange of queens? Let's just check this. After the exchange of queens, well, basically if g takes, let's have a look at g takes. There's rook e7, and rook e7 is apparently completely winning. There's a threat of g7. If rook g8, there's rook h7 mate. If king g8, let's have a quick look at that. G7, which forces the rook off the back row, because if rook f7, there's rook e8 now, just winning an entire rook. So even in this rook and pawn ending, with this pawn on d7 and this pawn on g6, this is just totally winning because of g7. I thought it was a beautiful game, and it demonstrates this revolutionary idea that David Bronstein had back in the 50s about opening theory. So I think it was a logical follow-on from yesterday's discussion video. We can have a look at the game in overview and summary again, but also I wonder if I can get some other relevant bits whilst promoting this book. I'm not trying to take the jewels of this book. I hope some of you guys might order this book from Amazon. Basically, if I can quote you something: as for opening strategy based on systems with counter chances, the ideologists here must be regarded as Nimzovich and Alekin, and in our time Botvinnik. We'll have something to say about these systems later. So Bronstein in Budapest had the mastery of all these elements of opening strategy, but on top of them introduced his own contribution. He came to the conclusion that for genuine creativity one must have two strategies, one for white, one for black, and secondly forcing variations should be personified, i.e. not a general best variation which should be prepared. Such a thing does not exist, but an individual one with a specific opponent in mind. The idea of a personal preparation is not itself new, but a forcing variation for each player in the tournament with white and black. This belongs to Bronstein. Moreover, he was perfectly aware that in forcing and especially individual variations, there is a possibility of an element of bluff. Now, so this guy is not David Bronstein; it's another commentator. But really, what I see from his games and his novelties is actually more simple. It's about creating winning imbalances, and I think this game is a fine demonstration of a redefinition of what an opening is. It's not about following databases, it's not about controlling the centre or having a nice pawn structure. It's not about creating imbalances in the passive sense, like giving the opponent semi-open c-file for your d-file. It's about creating winning trump cards. If you can do that from the opening, then you've played the opening well. So the winning trump cards here, even though he went a piece down, he's got potentially winning trump card of all his pawns being a dangerous phalanx and just steamrolling the opponent, as this game 1 from this very interesting book on my bookshelf demonstrates. So e4, he sacrifices an entire piece with d takes e4. Maybe some of you guys might try this variation in your own games, because you know we're in a popular line here. A lot of you might play bishop c4 already, and d5 is the reaction. The idea of just sacking the bishop is not crazy, not completely crazy, and we're all playing blitz online anyway, so do we have to play soundly? No. So doesn't matter what the computers think. If you can manage your winning trump cards here, which is the pawns, you know, maybe this is like an interesting playable variation in its own right, but conceptually we're talking about here a redefinition of what the opening means. So he's herding his pawns now, making sure that e5, which is a critical point in this position because it reflects a blockading square of this pawn inertia, so it needs to be kept under white's control. So he's very careful here to play rook a e1, doesn't want to allow bishop e2 to have black having the dark square bishop and a big, you know, clamp on the dark squares. So he plays rook a e1, key move, and he keeps control of that e5 square. Now he just has to bash down the light square blockade. So he starts to arrange g4, squeeze the queen, and now there's all sorts of wonderful possibilities that have arisen from this wonderful opening idea. Okay, so he plays now, the opponent plays f6, allowing further squashing of his pieces, and now the bishop is about to be squashed instead of g takes f. Anyway, black would be hijacking perhaps the g file if he's not careful, but this way there's no hijacking, this squashing with g6, and it still retains, you know, dynamic possibilities of d6 and knight f6s with g7 in mind, just to liberate this g pawn even further. So black gives up material, so white's okay now on material, and in fact white's quickly going a piece up himself, paradoxically, after that start. And now this final little touch, this knight takes f6, because of the back row weakness created by the pawn, and the rook is conveniently being able to play rook e8 now, as well as g7 being nice if g takes. So check, queens come off, and even in this position this is still completely winning with the knight hanging, because of the specific variations here to do with the pawn on d7 and g6. So rook e7, big threat of g7, and I think that was it. Okay, and we just demonstrated that with this g7, and this might have been a finish. Hope you enjoyed that. I hope that's a logical follow-up example game video for a revolutionary opening played with this idea which Bronstein had back in the 50s, that openings are not about opening theory. Openings about winning trump cards, generating them, managing them, steering them into a winning position. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.